Let's now examine a constructed response item and use the extended Angoff method to provide a rating for the item. Constructed response items are ones where the examinee must respond to a prompt with a short essay response. Here is a version of a constructed response item in relation to our Certified Parent Driving Teacher exam. The prompt asks the examinee to develop a plan for this mother that includes at least 3 separate locations where driving lessons can start. For each location, the examinee is asked to provide at least 2 driving skills that will be learned at each of those locations. The examinee is also required to list those locations in the correct order. Considering this item, and again the fact that this topic is part of our performance standard, which specifies that borderline examinees must know this topic, as a cut score judge, we must determine a rating in relation to this question's scoring rubric. In particular, we must ask, what is the expected point level for borderline examinees on this item? According to the scoring rubric, the point level 5 demonstrates a complete and accurate response. In order to receive a 5 on this item, the response must include 3 locations from a list that is not shown here, and the locations should be shown in the proper order. The response also includes appropriate skills for each location. Scores of 3 and 4 are given to responses that are accurate but may not be complete, and scores 1 and 2 are given to responses that are either incomplete or inaccurate. As a judge, we must consider the scoring rubric in relation to the performance standard as well as the item's qualities, just as we did with the multiple choice item. The rating we provide is the expected point level we think would be awarded to borderline examinees. We might consider that our first rating would be a 3 because the response requires so many elements, 3 locations, 2 skills at each location, and the locations must be in the correct order. There's a lot of room for mistakes to be made on this item. However, we might also consider that this is fundamental knowledge for parents who are beginning to teach their children how to drive, and perhaps our rating might instead be a 4 or a 5. Just as with the modified Angoff, in the extended Angoff, the judges provide their first ratings, have a discussion of their ratings, and then enter a final second rating if they choose to. According to this table for the constructed response items, we see that again the judge with rater ID 1 thought that overall the constructed response items on the exam would be fairly easy for the borderline examinees. This judge's mean rating for the items was 3.8. Judge number 2 again thought the constructed response items were more difficult overall for borderline examinees, since the mean rating for this judge was 2.4. To identify a recommended passing score for the constructed response items, the grand mean of the ratings is found. In this exam, the average score expected for borderline examinees on the constructed response items is 3.2. Since there are 5 total constructed response items on the test, we know that there are 25 possible points on the exam. By multiplying the grand mean rating of 3.2 times 5, we determine that the passing score should be 16 out of the 25 possible total points. As I mentioned before, the Angoff methods are used to identify a recommended passing score in relation to the performance standard. This passing score will be used to determine who passes, and thus who has the knowledge required to be certified versus who will not pass. After this part of the study, the panel of judges are asked to shift their thinking away from the borderline group of examinees, and they are asked to begin considering the total population of examinees. So whereas the Angoff method attempted to look at one of these specific but unknown points along the score distribution, in the Hofstee method we want to consider the entire score range. As the judges consider the entire range, we ask 4 questions, 2 which are centered on the exam, and 2 which are centered on the examinees. The first set of questions that are test-centered are 1. What is the lowest acceptable passing score, even if everyone were to fail? And 2. What is the highest acceptable passing score, even if everyone were to pass? The second set of questions that are examinee-centered are, what is the lowest acceptable failure rate, even if all examinees had high scores? and what is the highest acceptable failure rate, even if all examinees had very low scores. The first test-centered question essentially asks if we have a positively skewed score distribution, like the one shown here where most of the examinees have low scores, and our passing score results in everyone failing, what would be that lowest acceptable passing score? At what point along that score range would you rate the passing score to be your lowest acceptable passing score? The second test-centered question essentially asks if we have a negatively skewed score distribution, like the one shown here on the right, where most of the examinees have high scores, and our passing score results in everyone passing, what would be that highest acceptable passing score? At what point along the score range would you rate the passing score to be your highest acceptable passing score? Next, we examine the failure rate, which is examinee-centered. The first examinee-centered question essentially asks if we have a negatively skewed score distribution, like the one shown here where most of the examinees have high scores, what is the lowest acceptable failure rate we are willing to accept? What percentage or proportion of examinees are we willing to fail, even if most have high scores? The second examinee-centered question essentially asks if we have a positively skewed score distribution, like the one shown here on the right where most of the examinees have low scores, what is the highest acceptable failure rate we are willing to accept? What percentage or proportion of examinees are we willing to fail, considering that most have low scores? The average responses to these questions are plotted against the actual score distribution as shown here to identify a recommended passing score. This information is used along with the results of the Angoff method to help make the final decision of what the passing score should be. The Buke method is similar to the Hofstee in that we are again considering the entire population of examinees and the overall difficulty of the exam, but the questioning is much easier. We simply ask judges to consider what they believe the overall pass rate will be for the entire population of examinees, given what they now know about the exam. This pass rate could be anywhere along the score distribution. The average pass rate is then plotted against the actual score distribution to identify a recommended passing score. In the plot shown here, the failure rate is shown along the left-hand side, to which we simply took the average passing rate that was identified, 68%, and plotted it on the appropriate failure rate marker on the y-axis. Drawing a line to the curve and then down to the x-axis showed a recommended passing score of 71.95. Again, this information is used along with the results of the Angoff method to help make the final decision of what the passing score should be. Remember, the process of conducting a cut-score study is meant to ensure that errors in measurement are considered as a recommended passing score is identified. The methods that may be used are intended to ensure an objective process and decision is made, even when some information used in the process may be subjective. Thank you for your time and your support for the RAB QSA exam development process.